It was the kind of night where the rain poured relentlessly against the windows, a soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo through the empty house. The wind howled in the distance, bending trees and pushing the storm forward, as if urging it to be louder, stronger. But what happened that night wasn't the storm you should be afraid of. No, it wasn't the thunder that would rattle your bones. It was the silence that followed it. A silence so deep it felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. At first, it seemed like just another stormy night, but as the clock ticked on, something was off. Something that, if you dared listen closely enough, would make your heart race and your skin crawl. And by the time the storm passed, you'd wish you'd never heard it. You'd wish you'd never asked the question, what was that noise? What if I told you that, behind the scenes, there was something waiting? Something that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. Something that had already begun to stir, unnoticed, just waiting for the right moment to make itself known. Well, the moment was about to come. In the quiet of the night, it was almost too easy to miss. But for one person, tonight would be the night they couldn't ignore it any longer. What was once distant now came closer and closer, until it was impossible to pretend it wasn't there. This is the story of what happened that night, and it's one you'll never forget, if you're brave enough to keep listening. It was a quiet Friday night when Sarah made the decision to visit her childhood home. The rain had been relentless all day, but now, as she drove along the long, winding road, it was as though the heavens themselves were determined to wash the world clean. The tires of her car sliced through the wet asphalt, the rhythmic splash of water filling the otherwise silent car. The kind of silence you only find in places long forgotten. She hadn't been back in years. Her mind wandered back to the memories of that house, the old family home tucked away at the end of a narrow, desolate road. The house, with its peeling white paint and sagging roof, had always seemed so full of life when she was a child. But now it was different, distant, almost foreign. As she turned onto the long, overgrown driveway, the headlights of her car flickered, briefly illuminating the front of the house. The ivy had taken over, creeping up the walls like the fingers of something unseen, and in that moment, she felt a pang of unease settle in her stomach. She hadn't been back in years, but something tugged at her tonight, a reason she couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was the memories she couldn't shake, or perhaps it was the unease she felt about the house. After all, she hadn't left under the best of circumstances. As she pulled her car to a stop at the front door, the heavy rain drummed against the roof of her car. The old oak tree in the front yard groaned under the pressure of the wind. The familiar shape of the house loomed before her, but now, with the shadows stretching long across the lawn, it seemed almost unrecognizable. The porch light flickered on and off like a weak pulse. She hadn't even realized how dark it had become, and yet there was no one around. No lights from neighboring homes, no sounds of distant laughter or conversation. Just the storm and the stillness. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at her skin. She could hear the rain hitting the ground like a drumbeat, but it was the silence that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It was as if the house was waiting for her, watching. She could almost feel the weight of the place pressing down on her chest. With each step toward the door, her heart seemed to beat louder, as if the house itself could hear her. The porch was covered in debris, dried leaves and twigs scattered across the wooden planks, but still the air felt unnervingly still. As Sarah reached for the door handle, something inside her hesitated. It wasn't just the memories of the house that made her pause, but something else, something she couldn't name, a feeling that she was not alone. She turned the handle, the door squeaking open, revealing the darkened interior of the house. The familiar scent of dust and old wood greeted her. But there was something new too, something that smelled like damp earth. as if the house itself had been breathing, exhaling into the damp night air. Sarah stepped inside and was immediately hit by the cold, a chill that seemed to seep into her bones. She hesitated just inside the doorway, the sound of the rain growing softer as it was replaced by the eerie creaking of the house, settling. The stairs in front of her loomed up into darkness, the very same stairs she had climbed so many times as a child. But now, they felt different. The house felt different. The air hung heavy, thick with something unspoken. There was no sound of movement, no voices, no presence of life at all. It was as if the house had been frozen in time. Sarah stepped forward, her boots echoing softly against the floorboards. Her eyes scanned the room as she reached for the light switch. But just as her fingers brushed against it, something moved. Somewhere deep within the house, something shifted. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she told herself it was nothing. But that nagging feeling, the one she'd ignored for so long, was creeping back. The house was awake, and it was aware of her presence. And then, in the distance, beyond the old wooden walls, Sarah thought she heard a faint voice. Soft, whispering. Too quiet to make out, but loud enough to draw her attention. She turned toward the source of the sound, her heart pounding. What was that? The voice, if it had ever been a voice, stopped, and the silence returned, heavier this time. But Sarah didn't feel alone anymore. She wasn't sure how she knew, but it felt as if the walls themselves were pressing in on her, as if the house was alive, watching her, waiting. And then, just as she started to turn toward the door to leave, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Slow, measured, as if someone or something was walking toward her. Slowly, purposefully. And she knew, deep down, that she wasn't alone in that house. Not anymore. As Sarah stood there in the doorway, her breath shallow, her mind raced. The house, despite the storm raging outside, felt cold, unnervingly so, the kind of cold that clung to your skin and seemed to seep into your bones. She reached up instinctively to rub her arms, but the chill didn't seem to fade. It felt as if the house itself was watching her, waiting for something. A signal, an invitation. The rain outside began to fall harder, drumming relentlessly against the roof. But inside, the house was silent, almost too silent. The wind howled through the trees outside, yet the air inside seemed still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The faint ticking of a clock in the distance was the only sound breaking the quiet. She took a cautious step forward into the living room, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet, protesting her every movement. It had always felt like a home before, full of laughter, warmth, but now it felt different, cold, lifeless, as if it hadn't been lived in for years, yet she knew her parents had only moved out a few months ago. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She froze, listening intently. Had it been the wind, or was it something else? The sound came again, softer this time, but unmistakable. A muffled thud from somewhere above. She turned her head toward the staircase, which led up into the darkness of the second floor. She couldn't see anything from this angle, but her pulse quickened. The thuds continued, slow and steady, like someone, or something, was moving around up there. Her heart raced in her chest. She knew she should investigate, but something inside her was screaming to leave. Still, she forced herself to walk toward the stairs. With each step, her shoes echoed against the worn wooden steps, and she felt the house seem to close in around her. The walls creaked as if they were alive, groaning under their own weight, and the soft whisper of wind, once so loud outside, now barely reached her ears. As she reached the bottom of the staircase, she hesitated. The sound from above had stopped. Silence once again claimed the house. But it wasn't a comforting silence. No, this was a heavy, oppressive stillness, the the kind that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. She forced herself to take another step, but the moment her foot hit the next stair, something caught her attention. A slight flicker of light from the hallway, a lamp, one of the few still working in the house, flickered briefly before going dark again. A breath caught in Sarah's throat. She had checked the lights before. Everything had been working fine when she arrived. Her pulse quickened. She took another step, but this time the air around her seemed to grow colder, almost unbearable, a thick, suffocating cold that pressed against her skin. She shivered, her teeth chattering as she made her way further into the hallway. The wind outside intensified, the rain now slapping against the windows with violent force. The flickering lamp caught her attention once more. The dim light barely illuminated the hallway, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. As she walked toward it, she noticed the painting on the wall, the one her parents had hung when they first moved in. It was crooked now, hanging at an odd angle as if someone had pushed it, but she was sure it had been perfectly straight when she first entered. She hesitated for a moment before reaching up to straighten it, her fingers brushing the cold surface of the frame. It felt wrong, like the frame had been there too long, untouched. Her fingers trembled as she straightened it, but as soon as she did, the unsettling silence returned. She couldn't help but glance over her shoulder. Just a quick look, but enough to make her spine tingle, a sense of being watched just out of reach. It was then that the door at the end of the hallway creaked open, not with a bang, not with a violent force, but slowly, methodically, as though someone or something was waiting for her to look. Sarah froze in place, her breath caught in her throat. The door had never been opened before, at least not in her memory. Her parents had always kept it locked. Something stirred behind it, but it wasn't a living thing. No, whatever was there had been waiting, trapped in the dark behind that door, and now it was free. She felt a chill wash over her as she stared at the open door. The smell of dampness and mildew seeped through the cracks in the wood, but beneath that, something else lingered, something foul, something old. Her body screamed for her to run, to escape, but her feet refused to move. They were planted in place, frozen to the floor. She slowly turned toward the door, and as she did, a faint shadow flickered in the corner of her eye, just beyond the edge of the doorway. It was quick, too quick to catch, but it was there. She was certain. And then the light in the hallway flickered again. This time it didn't go out. Instead, it surged, brighter than before. But it was the reflection that caught her attention, the long, distorted shadow that stretched across the walls. It wasn't hers, and it wasn't the house's. Something, or someone, was in that room with her. Before she could react, the door slammed shut, cutting off her escape. The silence returned, but this time it was worse. The house seemed to close in around her, and Sarah's breathing became shallow, quick. Her thoughts were a blur. What had just happened? Had she imagined it? Was the house truly alive? And what was waiting behind that door? The wind howled once more, louder than before, but it wasn't enough to drown out the feeling of being watched, of something dark lurking just beyond the shadows. Something was waiting for her to make the wrong move. But how long could she stand there in the silence, unsure of what to do next? And then, just as Sarah finally gathered the strength to take another step, she heard it. A whisper. Soft, just a breath in the air, as if the house itself was exhaling. Or was it? Sarah's heart raced in her chest, each beat reverberating through her body as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The silence in the house was suffocating, but it wasn't the comforting stillness of an abandoned home. It was something else. It felt like the house itself was watching her, listening, waiting. She took a cautious step backward, her body tense. The shadow at the end of the hallway seemed to shift ever so slightly, as though something was moving just beyond her sight. A flicker of motion, just out of reach, But Sarah was sure she had seen it. Was it a trick of the light? Or was there someone, standing just beyond the edge of the darkened doorway? Her throat tightened. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream, to leave, but her legs refused to move. Her eyes, however, could not tear themselves away from the dark doorway at the end of the hall. The door, the one that had opened so eerily by itself, the one that had been so deliberately quiet in its opening. A chill coursed through her as she stared at it, feeling as though something was waiting for her to take another step. And then, just as she was about to look away, she heard it. A soft whisper, so faint at first that she thought it was only in her mind, but then it came again, clearer this time. A voice, low and almost soothing, but laced with an undeniable urgency. Sarah froze. The voice, her heart skipped a beat. She turned her head slowly, trying to locate the source, but the hallway was empty. No one there. The whispers seemed to reverberate through the walls themselves, as if the house was speaking to her. The words lingered in the air, hanging like a heavy mist, suffocating her with their weight. She wanted to leave. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn and run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. She couldn't move. The air grew colder, so much colder. A gust of wind swept through the house, though the windows were shut tight. It rushed past her, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of decay. A wet, musty odor that filled her nose and made her stomach churn. As the air grew colder, she shivered violently. But it wasn't just the cold that made her skin crawl. It was the feeling of being watched. She felt a presence behind her. A cold, oppressive weight that pressed in from all sides. She had felt it before, but never like this. It was as if the very walls of the house had eyes, as if they were closing in on her, waiting for the moment to strike. Her breath caught in her throat. The whisper came from behind her, so close that it seemed to be right in her ear. It was then that she realized she wasn't alone. The house wasn't empty. It never had been. Turning slowly, she forced herself to move, her legs shaking with every step, her eyes darting from corner to corner of the darkened hallway. The door at the end of the hall, the one that had opened on its own, was now completely ajar. A thin sliver of darkness beyond it, as if the very air in the room had turned black and dense. The shadows seemed to stretch from the inside, drawing her in, beckoning her closer. She didn't want to go near it, she knew she shouldn't, but something in the back of her mind told her that she had no choice. With each step toward the door, the air grew heavier. She could feel the house pulse, as if it was alive, as if it was breathing. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as her hand reached out to touch the door frame. The temperature dropped dramatically, and she could see her breath in the air. It felt like something was right behind her, just out of sight. She turned, but nothing was there, only the cold, dark hallway. She pushed the door open further, just a crack, and the temperature plummeted, her breath coming out in visible clouds. The room beyond was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through a small window. But as she stepped into the room, the temperature dropped even more. It felt as though she had entered a place outside time, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. As her eyes adjusted to the dark, she saw it. The shadow. Not a trick of the light, not a figment of her imagination. A shadow, tall and thin, moved across the far corner of the room. It was slow, deliberate, as if it knew she was watching it. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. Gone, as if it had never been there at all. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't alone. The house was full of them, spirits, or shadows, or whatever they were, waiting for her to make a mistake. And as the door slammed shut behind her, she knew that leaving was no longer an option. A figure stepped into the doorway, tall, with long, unnaturally thin limbs, a face obscured in shadow, its eyes glowing faintly red in the dark. The air turned colder still, and Sarah's blood ran cold. This wasn't a memory or a dream. This was real, and it was only getting worse. Her body froze in place, unable to move, unable to escape. The door was locked. The shadows were closing in. And she knew deep down that this house held something far darker than she could ever have imagined. It wasn't just a house that was haunted. It was the very walls that had once housed her family, walls that had witnessed countless tragedies, each one feeding into the darkness. And now, it was her turn. Sarah wasn't just being watched anymore. She was being hunted. Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the room, her breath shallow, her mind racing. The figure she had seen, a tall, shadowy presence, had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her alone in the suffocating darkness. The door had slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside with only the soft whisper of the wind outside to break the silence. The air felt thick, almost tangible, as if it were pressing down on her. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but her feet refused to obey. The longer she stood there, the more oppressive the silence became. The shadow had vanished, but it had left something behind, something worse. It wasn't just the fear creeping up her spine, it was the feeling of being watched, of something lingering just out of sight, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Without realizing it, Sarah's hand moved toward the small table in the corner of the room. The dim light from the flickering candle cast long, unnerving shadows across the walls. As her fingers brushed over the surface of the table, she felt something cold beneath her touch. A smooth, weathered object. Slowly, she lifted it, her fingers trembling. It was a photograph, yellowed with age and coated in a thin layer of dust. She stared down at the photo, her breath catching in her throat. The image was old, faded, but the faces were unmistakable. It was a photograph of her family, her parents, her younger self, standing in front of this very house. But there was something wrong. The photo wasn't taken at the front door, where she remembered it being taken. No, this was different. It was taken inside the house, inside this very room. The faces were distorted, the edges blurred, and behind them, in the shadows of the room, something else stood. A figure. The same shadow she had seen earlier, standing just beyond the frame, its features obscured by the darkness. It was impossible to tell if it was a man, a woman, or something else entirely. But one thing was clear. It wasn't supposed to be there, not in the photograph. Not in her memory. Her hands shook as she turned the photograph over, hoping for some clue. The back was scribbled with something in faded ink, words that sent a cold wave of dread crashing through her chest. The message, written in uneven, frantic handwriting, read, "They are coming for you. They've been waiting. Don't look behind you." Her blood ran cold as she looked around the room, her heart pounding in her ears. Had it been a warning? Had it been written by someone who had lived here before? The cold sensation of being watched intensified. She turned quickly, her eyes darting across the room, expecting to see the shadow lurking once more. But there was nothing, only the soft flicker of the candle. Her breath caught. Was that a door opening? From somewhere deeper in the house, not the room she was in. Her instincts screamed for her to run, but her feet felt like lead. She couldn't move. Something was pulling her deeper into the house, as though the walls were drawing her towards something she couldn't yet comprehend. The sound came again, a scraping noise, louder this time. It seemed to come from the floor above her. Slowly, she made her way toward the door, the photograph still clutched tightly in her hand. She knew she couldn't stay in this room, but every part of her screamed not to go any further into the house. She had to leave. But there was something in the air, an oppressive force, that told her there was no escaping now. The footsteps above her grew louder, closer, as though someone or something was pacing back and forth. Slowly, agonizingly slow. She reached for the doorknob, her fingers trembling, and pushed the door open. As she stepped into the hallway, the house groaned around her. The old wood creaked and cracked as if it were alive, breathing, aware of her every movement. Her mind raced. Was it someone in the house, a person, or was it something else? She couldn't bring herself to go up the stairs, not with those footsteps drawing closer. Instead, she turned and walked towards the kitchen, hoping to find some sign of life. Something that would explain the strange events unfolding around her. But the kitchen was empty, save for the faint smell of something rotten. The cupboards were open, the drawers ajar, as though someone had been rifling through them. It was then that she saw it, a small, leather-bound journal, wedged between two kitchen drawers. It looked old, its pages yellowed and frayed. She didn't want to touch it. She didn't want to open it. But something told her she had no choice. Slowly, she pulled the journal free, and as she did, a small piece of paper fell out from between the pages. She bent down to pick it up, and when she unfolded it, her blood ran cold. Written in the same frantic handwriting as the note on the back of the photograph, the message read, "They are closer than you think. It's already too late. Don't go upstairs." Her heart stopped. The footsteps above her had stopped, and in the sudden silence that followed, Sarah knew. She was no longer alone. The presence in the house had been waiting for her, drawing her in with each step she took. She glanced toward the stairs, her eyes widening in terror. The shadow at the top of the stairs. Was it there? Was it watching her again? Sarah didn't wait to find out. She dropped the journal, stumbling toward the back door, only to find it locked tight. She yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door, like everything else in this house, was not going to let her leave. She was trapped. The shadows were closing in on her. And then the whisper came again. It was louder now, clearer. Sarah's blood froze in her veins. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror. But all she saw was the empty, suffocating darkness. And then, the house was quiet once again. Too quiet. The air was thick with fear, and Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, each beat a loud, erratic drum. The darkness in the house pressed in on her, smothering her senses, each creak of the floorboards beneath her feet amplified in the dead silence. The wind outside howled with fury, but inside everything seemed unnervingly still. The whispers had stopped, and for a moment, Sarah convinced herself that maybe, just maybe, she had been imagining things. The house had a way of playing tricks on your mind. It was just an old house full of memories, strange sounds, and the occasional unsettling creak. She turned back to the back door, still locked. Her fingers trembled as she ran them along the edge of the frame, desperately looking for any sign that she could escape. But there was nothing. No release. No way out. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of something heavy crashing to the floor upstairs. Thud. A violent noise that shattered the tension in an instant. Her head snapped upward, eyes wide, her breath catching in her throat. The footsteps from above had started again, faster this time, more frantic. They were not slow, deliberate steps anymore. No, these were hurried, dragging footsteps like something or someone was in a panic, rushing toward her. Her pulse quickened, but her body refused to move. She couldn't take her eyes off the staircase. She stood frozen, her hand still gripping the door handle, desperately trying to open it. The noise from above grew louder, closer. There was no mistaking it now. The sound wasn't coming from the floor above. No, it was coming from right behind the door to the basement. The door that she had just closed. Her stomach lurched as the sound of scratching intensified, now coming from directly behind the basement door. But it wasn't just scratching. No, it was more than that. It was the sound of something trying to get out. And whatever it wasn't human. Then, without warning, the back door slammed shut with a violent bang. Sarah screamed, the sound echoing through the house, and whirled around to face the force behind the sound. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the door, the back door she had just touched, slam shut, as though some unseen hand had forced it closed with unnatural strength. The air shifted, as if the house itself had sighed in relief, but the relief was fleeting, swallowed by the weight of the dark presence that seemed to gather within the walls. She turned back to face the hallway, her breath quick and shallow. But as she did, her eyes locked onto something that made her blood run cold. Standing at the top of the stairs was the figure she had seen before. This time it wasn't just a shadow. It was a man, or something that looked like a man, but it wasn't human. Its skin was pale, sickly, stretched tightly over its bones, its arms too long and its fingers too thin. Its eyes were hollow, like two black voids that sucked in every speck of light around them. And its mouth was agape, wide enough to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth, yellow and crooked, as if they had grown unnaturally, like a predator waiting to strike. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but her body was paralyzed with terror. The thing stood at the top of the stairs, its head cocked to one side, as if studying her. The air between them crackled with a terrible, suffocating energy. Her knees felt weak beneath her as the thing took one slow step down toward her. Each movement was deliberate, calculated, and Sarah realized with growing horror that this creature wasn't just moving, it was feeding off her fear. She stumbled backward, her legs shaking beneath her as she backed into the wall, feeling the cold plaster press against her skin. But she couldn't look away. Her eyes were locked on those hollow, empty sockets, those eyes that seemed to pull her in, beckon her closer. She could feel it. She could feel the weight of its gaze on her soul. The fear was choking her, suffocating her. And yet her legs refused to carry her any further. She was trapped. The thing tilted its head, a sickening crack echoing through the room, and it smiled. No, it grinned. But it wasn't a smile of joy or amusement. It was a smile of hunger, a grin that spread unnaturally wide, revealing teeth that seemed to have been filed to jagged points. Its mouth opened wider still, as though it were preparing to speak or devour. Sarah's legs buckled beneath her, her body trembling in fear as the thing took another step and then another. She could feel the air growing colder still, as if the temperature were dropping with each passing moment. The shadows seemed to lengthen, creeping out from the corners of the room, crawling toward her. The house was closing in, the walls pressing against her like a vice, trapping her in the center of its web. And then, as the creature took its final step toward her, its mouth wide open, ready to devour her whole, the lights flickered once, twice, before plunging the room into darkness. The creature stopped moving, its form now nothing but an outline in the dark. But Sarah didn't need to see it clearly to know it was still there. She could feel it. It was close, so close. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the darkness, reverberating off the walls as the creature slowly moved toward her, its breath hot and foul against her neck. She could hear its ragged breathing, feel the moist warmth of its exhale. She could hear its teeth scraping against each other as if preparing to rip her apart. And then, just as Sarah's mind teetered on the edge of hysteria, the creature lunged. The world went black. The only sound left was the echo of her scream, swallowed by the darkness. The world had gone dark. The last thing Sarah remembered was the monstrous figure lunging toward her, its breath ragged, its twisted grin wide and hungry. But now, everything was silent. Too silent. The air was thick, pressing against her skin, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She couldn't feel her body, couldn't hear her own breath. Was she alive? Suddenly, a sharp gasp filled the silence, and Sarah's body jerked upright, as though she had been yanked from an abyss. Her chest heaved with desperate, shallow breaths, and she looked around, wide-eyed, panic flooding her system. But nothing. The room was still dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight spilling in through the cracked windows. The shadows were thick, but she could see them, could feel them, creeping along the edges of the walls. Was this a dream? Had she blacked out? Had the creature... No, it wasn't a dream. The scent of decay lingered in the air, clinging to her like a heavy fog, and she could still feel the oppressive weight of the house's gaze, watching her from the corners of the room. Her eyes darted around, but the creature, was gone. But then a new noise broke the stillness. Someone, was moving through the house, their footsteps soft but deliberate. Sarah froze, holding her breath, every muscle in her body tense. The noise grew louder, and with it came a terrible realization. The footsteps weren't coming from above. They were coming from the walls themselves. The very structure of the house seemed to pulse and breathe, the creaking of the wood growing louder with every passing second. The pulse of the house was too... wrong. It was unnatural, like something was being drawn toward her. The air turned heavier, colder, and the ground beneath her feet felt as though it was shifting, moving. She tried to push herself off the floor, but her legs were unsteady, like she was walking through deep water. Her head swam with dizziness, and she had to steady herself against the wall. And then a voice, faint but distinct, called out from the darkness. A whisper. It was soft at first, barely audible, but as Sarah strained to listen, it became clearer. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was her mother's voice. Sarah's heart raced as she turned in the direction of the sound. Her throat tightened and her hands trembled. "Mom?" she whispered, not daring to speak louder. "Is it you?" She took a step forward, and the room seemed to shrink around her, the shadows growing longer, stretching out toward her like claws. Sarah's pulse quickened. The voice, it sounded so real, so close. Her hands shook as she reached for the light switch, but before she could press it, the shadows in the room shifted. They seemed to grow, to stretch, taking form. A dark figure, her mother's figure, emerged from the darkness, standing at the far side of the room. Her eyes were hollow, empty, and her mouth was stretched in a grotesque grin, just like the creature Sarah had seen earlier. But this wasn't her mother. No, this was something else, something twisted, wearing her face like a mask. "No," Sarah whispered, stepping back, her body frozen with horror. "You're not her. You're not my mother." But the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching her, smiling that horrific, empty smile. The walls seemed to pulse with a sickening rhythm, the house itself alive with dark energy. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath shallow. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as if it was shifting beneath her like quicksand. She looked around desperately for an escape, but the door to the outside, the windows, everything was sealed shut, as if the house had conspired against her. The figure, no, it wasn't her mother, continued to approach, its eyes locked onto Sarah with a chilling intensity. And then it spoke again, but the words were not in the voice of her mother anymore. They were deep, guttural, and layered with an unnatural echo. Sarah's legs were shaking now, unable to hold her up as she backed into the corner of the room. She knew deep down that there was no escaping. She had stepped into something ancient, something that had been here long before she was born. The house was not just a house, it was a prison. A place where souls were trapped, cursed, bound to the walls, forever a part of the house's dark history. And Sarah had just become the latest victim. The figure raised its hand, its fingers long and bony, and Sarah's body screamed in protest, but she couldn't move. The house had already claimed her. As its cold, skeletal hand reached for her, the truth hit her like a bolt of lightning. The creature she had seen, the shadows that lurked in every corner, They weren't just random spirits or ghosts. They were trapped souls. And her mother? She had been one of them. The house had been feeding on them, pulling them in one by one until there was no escape. Her mother's face twisted in agony as she reached out to her. The truth was clear now. Sarah wasn't just haunted by the house. She was part of it. She would join the other lost souls, wandering forever in the darkness, cursed to torment anyone who dared to enter. And with that final terrifying realization, the house closed in around her. The door slammed shut, the shadows consuming her whole. And she, just like the others before her, was trapped forever in its dark embrace. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest, each beat like a warning, a reminder of the danger closing in. The house seemed to pulse around her, as if it were alive, its walls shifting and groaning, drawing her deeper into its suffocating grip. The very air was thick with tension, heavy with the presence of something far worse than she could ever have imagined. She tried to move, but the floor beneath her feet felt as though it were giving way, creaking and shifting with each step, the very foundation of the house groaning like it was alive. The shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, twisting and contorting into shapes that no longer resembled anything human. The walls closed in on her as she turned, her back against the old wooden panels. But no matter how she moved, it felt like the house itself was inching toward her, holding her in place, trapping her. Sarah's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. The windows, no, they were shut tight, sealed with old wood and rusted nails. The front door, the door she had tried to open earlier, was now locked from the inside, the key gone, lost to time. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. There was no way out. The house was keeping her here. With a gasp, she turned toward the stairs. The footsteps were growing louder, too loud now to ignore. They were not coming from above. They were coming from behind her, from the very walls themselves, as if the house had become an extension of the horrors within it. Her blood ran cold. She could feel the presence closing in, a palpable force, suffocating her. The spirits, no, they were not just watching anymore. They were moving. They were hunting. Her feet stumbled backward and she reached out instinctively, searching for something to hold on to. But the walls were shifting too. The floor beneath her feet groaned as if it were breaking apart. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with terror as she spun around to face the door she had tried to open. She threw herself against it, desperate, but it didn't budge. The wood was ancient, swollen from years of neglect, but it felt as though something more was holding it shut. Something inside the house, something that wanted her to stay. She pounded against the door again, her fists bruising against the wood, but it wouldn't open. A guttural whisper echoed through the room, the voice familiar yet distant, as though it came from the house itself. "You can't leave," it said, the voice low, suffused with malice. "You belong here now. You're ours." The words slithered through her thoughts like a poison, making her stomach churn. Panicked, Sarah staggered backward, her feet slipping on the slick, wet floor. The air around her seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping so rapidly that she could see her breath misting in the cold. The wind howled louder outside, but inside, it was the sound of something, someone, dragging itself toward her. Her heart pounded in her chest as the scraping grew nearer. She turned toward the staircase, but it was no use. The shadows at the top of the stairs were now more than just shadows. They were alive, shifting and twisting, forming shapes that defied reason. She could see them moving, feel their presence as if they were breathing down her neck. There was no escape, no way out. In a blind panic, she bolted toward the hallway, her legs weak beneath her, her body shaking with fear. But the hallway stretched longer than it should have, the walls seeming to close in on her, narrowing with each step. The sounds of the spirits, of the house, grew louder, filling the air with a cacophony of whispers and moans. Her eyes blurred with tears as she stumbled, her heart nearly bursting with the weight of terror pressing against her chest. She reached the end of the hallway, but there was nowhere to go. The end of the corridor opened into an empty, dark room, the walls stripped bare of any decoration. There was no furniture, no light, just the void. The walls seemed to pulse as if the house were breathing, exhaling a thick, suffocating darkness that surrounded her. It was as if the house had decided to consume her, to trap her in its very foundation. Sarah spun around, looking desperately for an exit, but the walls were closing in, the air growing heavier. She felt the ground shift beneath her, and with a scream she fell to her knees. The floor was cracking, splitting apart, and the air was thick with the unmistakable stench of decay. The house was alive, and it was pulling her down, dragging her into its depths. With a final deafening crack, the floor beneath her feet gave way. She felt the earth shift, heard the screams of the trapped souls echoing around her, and she was falling, plummeting into the blackness below. The last thing she heard before the darkness swallowed her was the voice, now clearer, louder, and unmistakably familiar. "You're ours," it whispered, and then everything went silent. The ground beneath Sarah had given way, plunging her into darkness. But it wasn't the cold, unforgiving blackness that terrified her. No, it was what lay beneath that darkness. The walls of the house, now cracked and shattered, seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her panicked heartbeat. The air was thick, heavy with a suffocating presence, a force so overwhelming that it made it impossible to breathe. Her chest felt tight, every breath a struggle, as if the house itself were pushing against her, squeezing the very life from her body. The fall seemed endless, but when Sarah's feet finally met the ground, it wasn't the solid floor she expected. Instead, she sank into soft, wet earth, the coldness seeping up through her shoes and crawling up her legs. The familiar smell of dampness and decay lingered in the air, mingling with the heavy scent of something far worse, something rotten, something that had festered for far too long. Her eyes struggled to adjust, but all she could see was shadow, endless shadows swirling around her like a thick fog. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, but the darkness was impenetrable. It felt like the very house had swallowed her whole, locking her in a place where time no longer existed. And then, from the depths of the darkness, she heard it. A voice, low and haunting, whispering from every direction. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was not her mother's anymore. It was a deep, guttural voice, echoing as though it came from the walls themselves, resonating in the very air around her. Sarah spun around, looking for the source of the voice. But there was nothing except for the darkness that pressed in from all sides. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a step forward, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. And then there it was, a flicker of movement in the far corner of the room. At first, it was just a shadow, but as her eyes adjusted to the dark, it became something more, someone more. A figure standing motionless at the far end, its shape barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, its body thin and skeletal, clothed in tattered rags that hung from its frame like discarded remnants of a forgotten past. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward, and she could see its face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to swallow the light around them. Its mouth hung open as though waiting to speak. But the words that came from its lips were not comforting. They were not familiar. They were the words of something ancient, something that had been trapped in this house for far too long. The figure raised one long, bony hand, pointing directly at her. Sarah stumbled backward, her pulse racing in her ears. It wasn't just any spirit. This was one of the lost souls trapped within the house. It was the same figure she had seen in the photographs, the one lurking in the corners of the room. She had seen its eyes before, those same empty, hollow eyes staring back at her. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The house was alive, that much she knew. But what was it? Why had it called to her? Why had she been drawn back to this place? It was as if the house had been waiting for her, waiting to claim her as one of its own. The figure took another step forward, its shadow stretching longer across the ground, reaching toward her. Sarah's legs buckled beneath her as she tried to step back, but the ground beneath her was shifting. It wasn't solid. The earth beneath her feet was soft, like it was moving with a mind of its own, pulling her deeper into the darkness. "You belong to the house now," the figure whispered again, its voice rising in pitch, a twisted grin spreading across its face. "You can't leave. You'll never leave." The last word echoed through Sarah's mind, sinking into her very bones, freezing her in place. There was no escape, no way out. The house had already claimed her, and now it would consume her just as it had consumed everyone else. Sarah tried to scream, to run, but the figure moved faster now, closing the distance between them. She could hear its breath, a low, rasping sound like a dying animal gasping for air. Her vision blurred, and she could feel the darkness closing in around her, the weight of it pressing on her chest, suffocating her. It was too late. She had waited too long. She had walked too far into the heart of the house, and now it was dragging her down into its depths. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, Sarah turned and ran, but the ground beneath her feet cracked open. The earth split, and she fell through the darkness, swallowed whole by the house, its hungry walls closing in around her. The last thing she saw before she was consumed by the void was the figure, smiling, its hollow eyes gleaming with malevolent satisfaction. And just like that, Sarah was gone. Another soul lost to the house, another soul claimed by the curse, bound to it forever. The house had claimed its prize, and now it would wait for the next one. The darkness was absolute. Sarah's scream echoed through the void, but there was no one to hear it. No one but the house. The weight of the shadows pressed in on her from all sides, and as she fell deeper into the blackness, the air grew thick, stifling, suffocating. Every breath was an effort, as if the very air was being drawn out of her. She tried to move, but the ground beneath her feet was soft, shifting, pulling her down, pulling her in. And then, just as she thought she would be swallowed whole, something changed. Something snapped like a string being pulled tight. The air around her shifted again, and the oppressive darkness broke, if only for a moment. For the briefest second, a pale light flickered. Weak, feeble, but there, enough to cast faint shadows around her. She looked up, eyes wide with fear, her heart pounding in her chest. She was in a room, but it wasn't the same room. No, this was different. It was colder, darker, and the walls seemed to be breathing. She stood, trembling, scanning the space around her. The light flickered again, just enough to reveal the figures standing in the shadows. Not just one, but several. Figures, dark and gaunt, their faces obscured, their bodies too thin, like the remnants of a forgotten past. But these weren't the figures she had seen before. No, these were different, more solid, more real, and they were closing in on her. Sarah's breath hitched as the figures moved toward her, the distance closing. She could hear their low whispers, not words, but something worse, something primal, something that made her skin crawl. They were speaking in unison, their voices melding together in a guttural chorus that rattled her very bones. "You cannot escape," they whispered, their voices vibrating through her chest. "You are one of us now. You belong here." Sarah felt the cold fingers of terror close around her heart. This was it. There was no escape. The house had taken her, trapped her, and now the spirits, no, the souls of those who had come before her were here, waiting, watching. But then, something even more terrifying happened. As Sarah tried to step back, her legs shaking beneath her, the light flickered once again, this time more violently. And in that brief moment of illumination, Sarah saw it. Behind the spirits, behind the figures closing in on her, was something far worse. A shadow. No, not just a shadow. It was the house itself. It loomed behind them, taking shape. Its outline shifting and twisting as though it were made of the very darkness. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, as if the house was alive, aware of her, its gaze locked onto her. The shadow stretched, reaching toward her, its tendrils curling like fingers, impossibly long, impossibly fast. And then, just as Sarah's mind raced to comprehend the nightmare unfolding around her, the house spoke. The words echoed through her mind, rattling her thoughts. She felt the weight of the house's presence, its crushing grip on her soul. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The room seemed to pulse, the walls closing in on her, the shadow of the house stretching toward her as if to claim her. Then, in an instant, she felt it, a cold hand wrapped around her wrist, fingers like ice digging into her skin, pulling her backward. She screamed, trying to break free, but the grip tightened. Her body felt as though it were being dragged away from the light, deeper into the abyss. The shadow loomed over her, its form now so vast that it seemed to fill the entire room. Sarah tried to pull away, her vision blurring as she struggled to free herself from its grip. But no matter how hard she fought, the shadow held fast, pulling her toward the heart of the house, toward the thing that had been waiting for her all along. The house wasn't just a building. It wasn't just some haunted place filled with lost souls. No, the house was the spirit. The house was the curse, and now she was part of it. She would never escape. She would never see the light again. She had become one of them, another soul bound to the house's dark embrace. And just as she thought she might pass out from the terror, just as her body gave in to the darkness, the voice whispered again, louder, more forceful, right in her ear. The ground beneath her gave way once again, and she fell. This time there was no scream, no fight left, just a deep, soul-crushing silence as she was swallowed whole by the house. And as the darkness closed in around her, she realized the truth. It had always been her turn. And then all was still. No movement, no sound. The house waited for the next soul to wander in, to make the same mistake Sarah had. And somewhere deep within its walls, Sarah's scream still echoed. And so Sarah's journey came to an end. Or did it? Was she just another soul lost to the house, trapped forever in its dark embrace? Or is there something even darker lurking beneath the surface, something waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? You see, the house, it never really lets go. It never truly releases its hold. Maybe Sarah is still here, wandering the halls, her spirit trapped in the same cycle that all the others before her have endured. Or maybe there's something else, something even more malevolent hiding in the shadows, something older than the house itself, waiting for its next victim. What do you think happened to Sarah? Do you believe she's still out there, a lost soul searching for escape? Or has she become something else, something more terrifying than anyone could imagine? I'd love to hear your theories. Drop them in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more chilling tales from the dark corners of the world. This house may have claimed one soul, but there are many more stories to be told. Some are just waiting for you to listen. Who knows? The next one might be closer than you think. Thank you for joining us on this journey. But remember, be careful when you wander into places like this, because in the end, the house always gets its way. See you next time, if you dare. The end.